everyone. Welcome to the Dole Institute. Sorry, it's a little loud, isn't it? Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. I'm Bill Lacey, the director. I can't tell you how happy I am to see you here for our very first in-person discussion group since March of last year, and it's very exciting. And we had fellows over the last 2 semesters, but they were virtual, and we found that this program works exceptionally well when you allow the students and members of the community to actually get to know and personally our fellow and their guests. We have an outstanding fellow for fall. Her name is Michele Watley. I met Michele, it was in 2016 at the post-election conference. You worked for Senator Sanders' campaign, and you were here to say hello to a dear friend, Simone Sanders, as she would say, no relation. And I got to meet you there, and I said to Michele, she was a very good friend with Simone, I said, why don't you join us for dinner? We were doing our friends' dinner that night, and I think you stayed and joined us for dinner.
I did.
And at some time, I think I pitched the idea of a fellowship to you, and then in 2018, I looked this up, it was early 2018, you submitted a fellowship proposal. And so we started working on timing. It takes a year or two to get everybody lined up, and unfortunately, the election kind of changed your fellowship. You had to kind of retool it a little bit. But the most interesting part of all of this is that this spring, when I was still working from home, I was downstairs watching the news while I was on my bike trainer, getting in a ride for the day. And I'm watching Channel 41, and all of a sudden they're doing this program on Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet, which was an organization started to empower African-American women and to work together to do and accomplish stuff. And all of a sudden they said, and we're going to interview founder Michele Watley. And I thought, oh, wow, this is really, right out of the blue. So I think I emailed you the next day or something. We traded email. But we are so excited to have Michele here. She's going to be a lot of fun and have great guests. She's got 2 great guests today. So everyone, please join me in a nice welcome for our fall fellow at the Dole Institute, Michele Watley.
Thank you, Bill, so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for joining us today. This is such a great crowd, especially considering everything that's going on with the pandemic. So we're so excited to have you here in person to have this great discussion. Thank you for joining me for our discussion series, What's the Matter with American Politics? As Bill mentioned, I'm Michele Watley. I'm the founder of the GRIO Group, a strategic communications and political advocacy firm, having worked in the political campaigning space for a number of years. Senator Bernie Sanders in his presidential run in 2016, I served as a national political director, but I've continued to work in the campaign space here in the Kansas and Missouri region ever since, having worked on some of the biggest issues in the region. But as he mentioned, I started Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet. It's a nonpartisan nonprofit aimed to amplify the voices and power of Black women, but it's named for Shirley Chisholm. Clap your hands if you know who Shirley Chisholm is. We know who Shirley Chisholm is here, right? Shirley Chisholm is the first Black woman to run for Congress, but she's also the first, and win. Let me make sure I mention that, she won. But she's also the first Black woman to run for president on a major party ticket. So as we work to amplify the voices and power of Black women, we take in the legacy of Shirley Chisholm and by helping Black women bring their own chair to the table if there's not a seat at the table made for them. My experiences in campaigns and politics has garnered a number of awards. In 2017, I was named the American Association for Political Consultants 40 Under 40 and Campaigns and Elections Rising Star. That's an award that's been given to political savants such as David Axelrod, Donna Brazile, James Carville, Laura Ingraham, and Alex Castellanos, who worked for the Bob Dole campaign in 1988. I'm honored to have been the first Black woman to receive both awards in the same year. So I'm really elated to have been given this honor. It's a prestigious opportunity to be a Dole Fellow. As Bill mentioned, you have to put in a proposal, you have to be chosen, and that's because this institution is named for a great congressman who did great work in politics, Congressman Robert Dole. A master of the practical politics, Bob Dole is noted for saying that all wisdom doesn't reside in one party, right? That is how he operated in Congress. He worked across the aisle to save Social Security, reform America's hunger and nutrition programs, reduce the federal deficit, and pass landmark legislation like the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's an honor to be here as a fellow under that legacy and lineage. And as a fellow, we have autonomy in choosing our discussion series. And when I had to think about what am I going to talk about over the next 7 weeks, I had a lot to pull from. In the last 4 years or so, we've had a lot of changes in America and in American politics that have forever changed and reshaped and reinstilled how we approach politics, not only today, but how it will impact politics going forward. And so in the spirit of Congressman Dole and reaching across the aisle, I've pulled together experts representing political ideologies from across the spectrum, a spectrum of experiences, women, people of color, young people, seasoned folks, so that we have a comprehensive view of what's taken place, and we have a comprehensive perspective as we look forward. So before we dive in, I want to take a moment to thank Bill Lacey for providing this opportunity. Bill Lacey is retiring, if you're not aware, closer to the end of this year, and he has served this institution for a number of years. I want to make sure I thank the SAB, the Student Advisory Board, for all the work that they've done to pull this together, and also the staff here at the Dole Institute for all the work that they've done to bring us all back together in person. I'd also like to thank Kansas Public Radio and Good Morning KU. They provide an opportunity for me to interview so that the students can learn about the discussion series. And last but not least, I'd like to thank the many professors who allowed me to come on campus and talk to their students about this series. Just a few housekeeping notes. In typical millennial fashion, I've pushed the Dole Institute to be innovative about how we bring in speakers and guests, which has been where they have been moving forward because of the pandemic anyway. And so some of our guests will be virtual. So we're using a hybrid model in that some of our guests will be virtual. But it also allows us to live stream, and we have people watching today who are watching us live as we speak, so thank you for joining us. For those of you who want to join the conversation from the virtual space, we ask that you email your questions, thoughts, comments that you want shared to dolequestions@ku.edu. I'll give that to you one more time, dolequestions with an S at ku.edu. And we'll get to all of the questions we can during our Q&A section. So with that, let's get this discussion started. You guys ready for the first in-person session? All right, that works. So today's topic is just going to be simply a review of politics and the happenings that have occurred and impacted politics in 2020, a little bit beforehand. And I have a couple of guests with me who are going to help bring perspective and insight to into that topic. We'll have our discussion for about 25 to 35 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers, and then I'll allow the panelists to go ahead and give some closing remarks. So with that, we'll start with some brief introductions. I'd like to start with Mindy Brissey. She is a principal at Powerful Performance Solutions. I've worked with her on many campaigns, and she's worked in the political landscape and space here in the Midwest region and beyond for a number of years, having worked with candidates on both sides of the aisle and candidates and elected officials at every level of government. Mindy, did you want to give a brief introduction?
Well, first of all, thank you. It's an honor to be here as a KU grad myself and member of the alumni. I was really happy to be asked to participate in this. I was a student when the Dole Institute first opened, not to date myself too much. So thank you, Michelle, for having me, and thank you to all the staff for putting this together. I really appreciate coming and talking to students. I really enjoy doing that. A little bit about myself. I grew up in Kansas. I remember when the senator was in office, Senator Dole, from being a very young girl at my grandparents' house. In those days, everybody read a newspaper every day and watched the evening news while they ate dinner. So I have a long history in Kansas and growing up. And when I got older, I moved to Missouri, which is vastly different than Kansas for being right next door to each other in the political atmosphere especially. So I've done the gamut of work in both government relations, organizing political campaigns, political consulting. Currently, I do the campaign management for Congressman Emanuel Cleaver, who's the 5th District of Missouri, the greater Kansas City area and on to the east from there. and have also done down to probably one of my proudest accomplishments was getting the first female woman of color elected to the Raytown, Missouri Board of Aldermen a few years back, and she won that election by 5 votes. So sometimes it's the smaller things we do that have the biggest impact, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So thank you for having me.
No, thank you for joining us. We have a virtual panelist also joining us, Rashard Young. He is a highly active in government affairs, lobbying, and campaigns and consulting. He serves as Vice President of Government Affairs for Software, a firm dedicated to securities and technology, and he's run for office here in Kansas. But I'll give him a moment to introduce himself so he can talk a little bit more about his experience and what it was like to run for office in Kansas.
Thank you, Michelle. It is an honor to be here today. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but very humbled and honored by the opportunity to speak. Michelle kind of mentioned it. I'm currently VP of Government Affairs for a cybersecurity company, and by no mistake, there's a lot of breaches going on today, both in the private sector, commercial, and our government. And so we've had the blessing to be pulled in on those type of efforts. But prior to even getting there, I grew up on the Missouri side. I was born in Emmanuel Cleaver's district, and transferred over to Johnson County Community College. Had the pleasure of going through a legal studies development kind of series through my education, and met Congressman Kevin Yoder, and ended up working for him. And so my background really from there kind of went on to leading campaigns, lobbying, getting another congressman, Jake Turner, who's currently in the 2nd Congressional District, who holds that seat, from working for the Attorney General, Derek Schmidt, um, to now getting into the cyber government affairs space. So it's a blessing to be here, and I look forward to sharing my experiences.
And before we move forward, tell us about your campaign for office here in Kansas.
Yeah. So I ran for political office here in Kansas, District 16, in Johnson County. That's the Johnson County Community College area, which is near and dear to my heart. Part of my story, for those who don't know, is came from a very rough background and struggled to educate from an education standpoint. Learned how to read and write there. I had teachers that really loved me and took me under their wing, and so it meant a lot to be able to run in that district. It was a very close race. The Kansas City Star ended up endorsing me, which is a blessing. And I ended up losing by 4 or 5 votes. So, Mindy, that's the other side. Maybe next go around you can help me get a win.
When people say their vote doesn't matter, it's stories like this that I
Yeah,
like to point to and say, no, it could, like, literally 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 votes
definitely.
could be the difference between you being the next Republican State House representative and you not being
Right.
in office. So votes matter. Well, with that being said, we'll go ahead and dive into the questions. This is very much a discussion, so feel free to give information as you see it. You don't have to wait on me to answer or ask questions or give you the opportunity to speak. But I want to start with some level setting and talk about some research I was able to pull up. A CNN poll found that over half of Americans, around 56% of Americans, believe that democracy is under attack, while a poll by the Cato Institute found that 62% of Americans say that they have political views that they're afraid to share. And then research by Hamilton College conducted surveying of young people. They found that despite the common belief that young people are not involved in politics, which should be questioned at this point, we have research that shows that there was an uptick in young people voting in elections in the last few cycles. But despite that common belief that young people are not involved or interested, over 70% of those surveys said that they've registered to vote, and over 60% had indicated that they had been involved in some sort of political action or engagement. But when asked about their lack of participation, that perception, 30+% said that politicians didn't pay enough attention to young people's concerns. And another 30% said that they didn't like all of the political negative campaigning. And that's what pushed young people away from being involved civically. That's a lot of diverging views about the state of American politics and our democracy. And so to start the discussion, I want to ask Mindy, what has transpired so far in 2020 and 2021 that you think has led to such divergent views about the status of American democracy and politics and political engagement?
So I think in many ways it was almost the perfect storm with COVID and social media. Everybody had to stay home. They weren't out doing their regular activities, interacting with people on a regular everyday basis, and so a lot of America turned to social media to kind of feel connected and stay connected, which really was a continuation of the presidential election of Donald Trump's first term. You know, he largely was the first president successfully used social media to win a campaign. It played a huge role, I think, more so than what maybe people on the other side had expected it to play in delivering a win. So I think as more people turn to social media instead of each other for discussion, it just made everybody more polarized because you're only getting what you agree with in front of your eyes and reading. And a lot of people, I have a 20-some-year-old child, so I often ask him about what his views are, what his activity is on social media, and he deletes people who don't agree with him, even within the family. So when you're constantly being reinforced in what you think, your mind isn't really open necessarily anymore to maybe looking at it from another side. I do the opposite. People I disagree with, I purposely leave them as my friends because I want to know what they're saying and where they're coming from and see what maybe other thoughts are that are not necessarily aligned with mine.
Yeah, and, you know, there's a book by Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat, that essentially forecasted that with the onset of social media and the internet and having so much information, people being inundated with information, that they wouldn't be better informed, that they would just gravitate to the viewpoints and information that essentially confirms what they think. Rashard, what are your thoughts, especially as a younger leader in the political space? What do you think has contributed in the last few years to such divergent views about the American democracy and political engagement?
Yes, Mindy nailed it. COVID, right? So even prior to COVID, I think what we were struggling with as a nation was just consistent ideology, right? Consistent voices of folks really trying to bring us together. But when COVID hit, folks were home. They're in front of TVs, videos, um, and they're really not able to be out and engage and have discussions. And so, we had several, I think a couple of different trials on police brutality. And, it kind of felt like a pressure cooker during this time for our nation. The tolerance level was very, very low for a lot of people. And I think that disrupted a lot. And, some of the challenges in that as individuals, as people, is you begin to kind of rank yourself on a scale of wokeness or not, and all those types of things. And so I think those when the opinions really start to increase, and people are either more outspoken about it, which causes conflict, which I believe in healthy conflict and necessary conversations, or folks, redact and really close themselves off. So being
Well,
home.
and, sorry. Yeah, and back to your point about people being closed off or kind of going to their own corners, I think you're seeing hyper partisanship come to play in a way that maybe we haven't seen it in the last few years, which essentially flies in the face of what Congressman Dole practiced as a congressman, and that he worked across the aisle. Mindy, you mentioned the role that President Trump and his campaign played into what we're experiencing now. What are some of the other issues that maybe occurred in 2016 and 18, campaigns of 2016, 18, whether local or national, that may have brought us to where we are today with the partisanship and, again, kind of diverging views in American politics?
Sure. So I think, campaigns, I'll use that as an example. Previously to COVID, you went out, especially the Democrats, knocked on doors, talked to the voters face to face. You made that personal connection. You have events where people come in person, opportunity to meet the candidate in person, whatever level they're running for, and really just kind of more of a face-to-face interaction. And then all of a sudden, everybody who does this kind of work, their heads were spinning and scrambling, trying to figure out, do you go knock on doors during COVID? Do you still try and get that personal interaction. At the same time, you have technology continually to advance, where now if you're watching Apple TV, I can put a commercial of my candidate up based to the demographic, where my neighbor might have a completely different commercial that speaks more to their beliefs, all based on what we know from everything everyone's clicking on online and on social media and on their phones. So as the technology tries to keep up with people's habits, or is it people's habits then driving the technology? That's kind of where those two things collide. But there's also, going back to our previous question, was good things that have happened from everybody turning their focus to social media. A lot of social justice happened and brought people together for huge demonstrations across the country about police brutality and the police and law enforcement's relationships within their communities. And we've seen lots going on with that. And we've seen people come together in ways they thought maybe before they wouldn't have. And so in that way, there's been a positive side also. I think we tend to focus most on the negative because it evokes the strongest emotions out of each of us, and we forget about some of the positive. And there's other positive things that social media has brought about in getting people together, not just in this country, but around the world.
Yeah, I think it was very much a bridge, and we did see some benefit from that. But I think 2016 and 2018 were very interesting years in politics overall. We saw a number of states flip for candidates that we didn't expect. In 2018 here in Missouri in particular, we had a very interesting Senate race with former Senator Claire McCaskill losing her seat. But ballot initiatives in Missouri like medical marijuana and minimum wage passing overwhelmingly, which means there had to have been Republican support. And so I think that 2016 and 2018 really laid the stage for what we have and what we're experiencing in politics today. Rashard, what are your thoughts on the role of elections in 2016 and 2018 and how they shape politics where we sit here in 2021?
Yeah, I think the rhetoric used in 2016 on both sides, I know drove a lot of Americans insane. And to Point Break, you mentioned it. Americans are saying, look, we're tired of the slander when it comes to campaigns. But there's overwhelming data that supports that these are accurate thoughts. So when Mindy's talking about technology catching up to people's habits and what people think and the information we're gathering, it really drives the question, what can we do during election years when we know things are going to get more heightened as people and as young people? What can we be on the whereabouts about? And so I think 2016, 2018, up until this point, there's been a lot of really hardcore push for division in some ways, right? Division sometimes accomplishes a goal for the political aspect of things, but it damages the American soul, if you will. So 2016, I think definitely the way social media was used, the media establishment in and of itself was used, um, is maybe discouraging a lot of young people. I know on campuses, as I've traveled the state of Kansas and Missouri, KU, Pitt State, Wichita State, Emporia State, and I've spoken to students all over about the importance of civic engagement. Uh, and so I think there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a moral obligation and responsibility we have as the next generation to be able to change and make sure things like 2016, 2018, up until this date, don't continue to happen.
I think also as the rhetoric has drove everyone to extremes, I think probably a lot of people found themselves commenting on posts on Facebook saying things they never really thought they would before. But I think it also drove people's actions to the extreme. I have I live in the Northland of Kansas City, so there's a Northland Facebook page for people to post different things happening and going on, and that used to be about somebody's missing dog, things like that, and it really got more political on the rhetoric and things people were posting. And I also noticed that it drove people to more extreme actions where they were missing that middle link of action. So, for example, I'll just use Kansas City, Missouri for an example. We have had petitions circulated for recall of people on the city council and the mayor. And as I read about this on the Facebook pages and online and what people's comments are, my first thought is, I wonder how many of them voted in the last municipal election, number one. Number two, did any of you pick up the phone and call your city council member or the mayor's office and express your displeasure with whatever it is that you're now trying to recall them over? it just seems like we go from one extreme to the next, and then the people who are moderate and in the middle have been left out of the conversation when they're actually the ones who will swing an election one way or another in most all cases.
Well, and when you talk about there being extremes in opinions, it seems like there are extremes even in actions. People are vocal, but there seems to be a disconnect between that vocal disdain for whatever it is or support for an issue and making the connection to the elected officials that can make the difference. A lot of that was said about the protest in the summer over the George Floyd situation, that while there were great protests and you saw a diversity of Americans coming together in ways that we hadn't seen in the civil rights movements and movements past, but that action necessarily hasn't led to political change. Can you speak a little more to that? And Rashard, I'll give you the opportunity to answer that too. Is there a disconnect between the perceptions and feelings that Americans may have about American democracy, but taking direct action to change it?
Sure. So I think no matter what you're talking about, if you're talking about policy or candidates or initiatives or anything, you kind of have a third. You have a third of people on this side, and you have a third of the people on this side, and then you have kind of the third in the middle. And typically, that third in the middle is who are open to going either way and, you know, kind of weighing out all the different angles of it and picking a side in the end. So again, that's the part that's missing, which is that moderate middle. And, you know, that's whether you're talking about taking action on something, or because, as I was saying before, everything seems to be extreme. Forget all the steps in the middle to affect local government or state government or federal government. You know, a phone call to an elected's office goes a long way. People don't think to pick up the phone and call. When working for a mayor on a ballot initiative to get it through the council to be put on the ballot, and there was a lot of back and forth, and the council was very divided about what they wanted to put into this ballot initiative package. And the mayor was a very strong mayor, was very good at putting things together. What we decided to do to move some council members was generate 10 calls to that council member's office, and we knew that would move them quickly because nobody ever calls the council members' offices to say, hey, I don't like this, or I do like that, or please more of this or less of that.
Rashard, what are your thoughts?
Mindy nailed it. I mean, my time at the Attorney General's office was specific to that. You know, my job in general was to find trends and recognize things and bring them to the Attorney General's attention. And so it is very effective when you pick up the phone and you take action. You know, I think the cognitive dissonance in our day is it's not enough to just get out, you know, paint a sign and go out on a corner and scream, right? You know, it's not enough to just use your voice and be, quote, an advocate. What are you practically doing, right, to build a community? I know I've had a conversation with some of my dear friends who are of other ethnicities, and during the height of the racial tension, it's Rashard, what can I do to be effective in this community? Not just post the black square, not just go along with the virtual movement, but what can I actually do to make a difference? And so, you know, we go to Church Under the Bridge, we go and serve at the Somalian refugee communities downtown. You know, we go help at shelters, we go help Freedom Fire, and we're actively giving back and supporting this community under this racial distress.
No, that is all very good information. It makes sense. Remember, if you're watching us virtually and you have questions, you can join the conversation by emailing your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. We'll ask the questions at the Q&A section, but getting your questions in now will ensure that we can get them to the top of the list and make sure they're asked. We talked about the different political figures that have impacted politics and brought us to where we are today. What are some of the non-political or politically adjacent factors that have contributed? We talked a little bit about COVID. We talked about protests and movements. I mean, between 2016 and today, you have everything from the Me Too movement to Black Lives Matter. We have had a number of movements that have shaped the landscape. We talk about campaign finance reform and money in politics. That has definitely shifted and changed how we approach campaigns and how those running for office run their races. What are some of the politically adjacent or non-political factors that have impacted the current political landscape we face today? And Rashard, I'll turn it over to you to start.
Yeah, I know from off top, just the efforts at the university levels, right? It doesn't matter which side you're on. There's been a lot of outcry and folks really stepping up and talking about, okay, what's being discussed on campus? What ideologies are being put before us? How is history being taught? What are those things looking like? And so you're seeing an energy, from my personal opinion, in the traveling that I've done coming from the universities, whether it be on issues of critical race theory or student loan debt, or the national debt. Young people are really starting to get energized and starting to have more of a voice in our local elections. And so I was really encouraged by that here in Kansas this last election cycle.
Yeah, you brought up critical race theory, and that has energized not only young people, but it seems like a lot of people. A lot of people have taken to their school boards and to other educational governing bodies to make their stance heard either for or against critical race theory. But you wouldn't think of curriculum being political at first glance. Mindy, in your opinion, what are some of those, again, politically adjacent or non-political factors that have shaped political landscapes for today?
So I think in many ways people felt more empowered to stand up and speak, but it was interesting where we saw it directed to. Public health officials who quit their jobs in droves across the country because of things as extreme as death threats, and just the sheer overwhelmingness of negativity directed towards them. Nobody knew who their local health department official was previous to COVID and mask mandates. I think you also see kind of the same with school boards. Most people don't bother with the school board attending the meetings or providing testimony or comment for the public comment. And now you have not only parents and citizens turning out in droves to the school board meetings and writing nasty things about people online, you have the Attorney General of Missouri suing local government for things that they are within their power to execute on, such as mask mandates and different things. So the legal system is also coming into play in a very more so political way than it has in the past. Typically when you think of politics and the legal system, you think of the Supreme Court and Supreme Court rulings, but now we have it down at the local level even, and Rashard might have more comment on that given his background. He's probably a little bit more familiar.
Mm-hmm. Rashard, did you want to provide comment on that?
Yeah, it's getting very ugly. Obviously, it's not attractive when you see your governor suing someone or your attorney general suing someone. There's a lot of lawsuits flying everywhere, and I know a lot of people, it goes over their head. Probably didn't even realize the state could be sued. The state could file a lawsuit against the president in all types of situations, and so it is a very messy situation. But like Mindy said, it opened up, all of this has opened up the conversation of who is running for mayor in my municipality, who's running for city council, state legislature, Johnson County Community College Board, um, the school boards. Who are these people? And it's really forced our communities and our nation to really kind of stop and take a look at really what's going on. Um, and a lot of it's being shaped. Even on critical race theory, it's being shaped. It's all about how you view your nation, right? What information you think should be taught to students, parents, and people, and what information should be withheld. And so, I think this whole season that we are going through is really challenging us as people to really stand up, be more educated, take better action on what's going on.
You use a word to describe the current state, nasty, a word that had been weaponized and garnered a lot of fodder during the 2016 elections. But I think for those who sit on the other side of the critical race theory argument or sit on the other side of masking and how to prevent COVID, they would see this as political engagement and action, taking action, making their voices heard. Where does the line stand in participating in democratic processes and democracy and going into a space that perhaps is beyond that? In your mind, where is that line drawn, and then where have Americans stood on that line?
I'll say this, especially because we're talking to students. Facebook is not going to help you get your way. However, if you want the politicians to pay attention to you, vote. Every state has a voter database, and it's public record. Most people don't know that. There's public record that you went and voted and which elections you voted in. And when you are operating a campaign, whether it's for the United States Congress or whether it's for the local school board, the people you are going to go talk to are the people who vote. And voting is a habit like any other habit in life. If you brush your teeth twice a day, you get in the habit, you just keep doing it, you don't think about it. If you started voting when you were 18 or your parents took you to vote with them, it becomes a habit. I grew up mostly with my grandparents, so it wasn't a choice. You registered to vote when you were 18, you read the newspaper, you paid attention, you made education a core part of your life. This was previous to social media, though. So if you want a politician's attention, vote. That is the easiest way to get it, because when they go out, when they send mail, when they knock on your door, when they send you a text message, they're sending it to people who vote, because they do not have enough money to try and engage people who don't vote. I was involved years ago, an organization called America Coming Together, who spent tens of millions of dollars across the country in a huge voter registration effort to then try and turn around and get them all out to vote in the presidential election. And it was a huge waste of money, because the turnaround was for the amount of money spent, the amount of people who then went out and voted after they registered them was really, really low. And they were a nonpartisan organization, but I would suspect their hopes was for a Democratic president to win, and they lost by a lot. So it really is a habit, and it's the best habit to become civically engaged. It's kind of the gateway to being civically engaged, because you know you're going to have to go vote. Well, you're going to have to figure out who you're going to vote for. And don't believe what they tell you. Do your research. So I think that's a good place for people to start first. And organically, it kind of leads to being more involved and, don't get caught up in social media. Be open to hearing other people's opinions.
I'm going to give you a little pushback and play devil's advocate. We tell people to vote. We tell people to get engaged. We tell young people in particular. We tell Black audiences and communities, constituencies to vote if you want to see change. But for these constituencies, as the research I just named states, that they vote, but they don't always see change. They don't always see the fruits of that labor. What do you say to people who may say to you, I vote in every election I vote, but I still don't see public servants who speak to my issues or concerns, or Black women who, again, are the most engaged electorate in the United States, voting at record numbers in almost every national election here in recent years, but not seeing Black women get elected. There are no Black women in the Senate, for instance. What do you say to folks who push back and say, well, that sounds good. I'll register and then call off of work on a Tuesday in November and drudge in the snow, although there's COVID, that I could possibly, how do you convince those folks that voting is simply the first step?
So a lot of people tend to vote just in the presidential election years and the presidential election. And they don't vote in those lower level races. And really, those are the ones you really need to be engaged on, because the city council and the county commission are doing things that are having a direct effect that you're going to feel on your everyday life, way more so than what the President of the United States is doing, or the U.S. Congress in many respects. And they're more accessible. The city council doesn't leave to go to Washington, D.C. or to Topeka for 6-8 months out of the year. They're here, they're in your community, their kids are going to school with your kids, you see them at the grocery store. And really, they most likely ran for city council out of a sense of civic duty. So really tapping into that. And I've never met a politician who doesn't love talking to a group of people, especially young people. Politicians love, and elected officials love talking to young people. The energy from young people is really contagious. And so it's really great feedback. And it's also a way to talk about things without all the rhetoric around it and all the politics around it. So call them, they'll talk to you. They'd be more than happy. They'll come talk to your school groups. They'll talk to any groups. They really do. Every politician I've ever worked with, that was the favorite part of being elected, was out talking to people.
Rashard, I'm going to give you the same question. What we saw in the most recent presidential election was a question arise about the validity of those elections and people's votes counting from the Republican side. And as a candidate who's run for office as a member of the Republican Party, what would you say to Republicans and other voters who said, hey, I voted in 2020 and my candidate didn't get elected and the election was rigged? How do you convince them that, if you do at all, that those votes count and that that's a necessary step in our democratic processes?
Absolutely. I think the first start is what I'm learning today, that our faith and our stock is not in our presidential candidates. It's not in our governor. It's not in our congressmen and women, our senators, but our stock should be in our faith in the collective as a community. I think what a lot of young people are being very exhausted by is because they're highly intelligent, and they sit back and they watch the trends and they see everything that's happening, and they don't praise, right? Um, those officials. When you get down to the policy standpoint, young people are starting to see the cognitive dissonance, how, you can say you represent something, but the outcome is different, right? I think African American women here in America are seeing that, right? Voting faithfully, have stood strong for their families, post slavery and through Jim Crow and through 94 and through all those different ages, but aren't seeing the change. The rhetoric sounds good, right? Um, Everyone gets on TV during an election year and says all the good stuff. And so I would encourage not only them, but Republicans, young people, people who vote. That's just the beginning. And you have a moral obligation to do that. That's just the beginning. The real work begins when you learn to take the time, right? Why should I care about what bill just passed? Why should I care about what my congressmen or women are co-signing or signing? It's because that policy can tell you where their heart is. It can tell you uh, where the real change is going to happen. And so, I think that's part of the problem. Most Americans, we're trying to raise our family. We're busy, soccer practice, all this church, you name it. And the devil's in the details, and things are slipping through the cracks. And so voting in and of itself is not enough. You must take an extra step to examine um, your candidate, hold them accountable, and make sure the rhetoric lines up with the action.
Well, in 2020, we saw a very contentious presidential election, probably one of the longest election seasons ever. I feel like, yeah, that went way longer than we expected. We didn't get results for almost a week after the elections occurred because of everything that happened. And what we saw was a transition of power, and that former President Trump was not reelected for a second term, and now we have President Joe Biden. So we've had a lot of changes at the national level, and not only how we campaign, but who those elected officials are and the parties they represent and the issues that they represent. Before we go into our Q&A here shortly, my next question for the two of you is, how has everything that's taken place at the national level impacted politics at the local and state levels? And you both alluded to that a little bit, but how has that transition in political power at the top of our government here in the United States impacted what happens right here in Kansas City and Johnson County and Lenexa and the local municipalities that oversee and govern our day-to-day systems in existence?
So, as I said before, all the attention is always on the presidential election. All the media outlets across the country cover it, foreign countries cover it. It's big money. There's big money in presidential campaigns.
Billions of dollars were spent. Like,
we're talking, yes, billions of dollars. And when you get down to, say, a state representative race, you got to rely on your network of people you've built up to that point in your life and call and ask them to write a check for you for something that you're not sure is going to come out the way you want it to. But really, you're asking people to invest in you and your vision representing your community, and you have to see if you're in line with that vision. And money has played more and more and more of a role in politics over the last 20 years very quickly. And it depends on where you live. Kansas, in my professional opinion, has a much more level playing field because of the state ethics laws. State legislators can't take campaign contributions during the state legislative session. That sets a completely different tone in the city of Topeka than it does in the city of Jefferson City, Missouri, where there are fundraisers every night for the legislators while the session is happening. They're huge PAC fundraisers. There, until recently, was unlimited campaign contribution limits in Missouri, whereas Kansas has always had campaign contribution limits for the state level and on down. Which in Missouri, that's opened the door to elections being bought almost. Missouri also has the ballot initiative, which allows, really in many cases, one individual in Missouri to pay to get ballot initiatives on the statewide ballot and get the law changed. They've been unsuccessful less times than they have been successful. But I don't think people understand the role that money plays. And it also puts your elected official in a bad position where right after they're elected, they have to start worrying about raising money for their next campaign while they're also trying to do the people's work and represent you at the council level, the state level, and the federal level.
Well, couple that with term limits that are now a lot shorter. You've got a 2-year term. You're spending half of that time fundraising for your next election or your re-election. Rashard, what are your thoughts?
Can you restate that question again? I'm sorry.
Sure. We've seen changes at the national level, at the congressional level in politics, and who's elected and parties represented. We now have a Democratic majority at the congressional level with a Democratic president and Senate and House. How has that impacted politics at the local level in Johnson County and Lenexa and Kansas City? What impact has that had on local governing bodies?
Yeah, most commonly, what's happening is for, state legislatures, state senators, folks who are running for local races. I know for me, back in 2016, it really didn't matter if I loved Trump or hated him, because I had an R next to my name, right? I had to stand on that front porch and answer to some of the things he might have said or he might have done, right? Fast forward into today, each president has the opportunity to take responsibility for what's going on or launch the attacks otherwhere in other places. And so I think learning today that on the local level, we have responsibilities that affect us every single day. We have very unique things that are tailored to us specifically, like you mentioned. And so those elections are the ones that we really need to be focused on. But everything we do up top and at the higher level, whether it be Congress or Senate, it trickles down. So I definitely think that communication in both caucuses, both federal and state, need to be aligned.
Yeah, that Trump coattail is very real.
No, yes.
Yeah.
And the candidates who had to run either under that, on those coattails or against those coattails were definitely impacted in their local races. And so I'm glad that you named that. So we are now at our Q&A portion of the discussion. Again, if you're joining us virtually, you can join in on the discussion too. Be sure to email your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. And we'll go from there. And so we'll start with some of the first questions here in the audience. If there are any here in the audience, we can take questions from there.
It seems like one of those areas that's changed over time, unfortunately, has been our degree of reliance on scientific decision-making, using evidence to make decisions. And, I think it's changed in a very poor way in that we can't trust the science for COVID. And I almost wonder what's going to happen after COVID for the next medical condition or whatever that comes into play. And will we continue not to trust the science? Could you speak to that?
So I think in large part that's a leadership issue. I think we all look to different people in the community, not just elected people, but also electeds from the president on down for leadership when we get into a crisis. There was a lot of talk around the 9/11 anniversary about how different Congress reacted to that major tragedy versus how they've reacted to COVID and things happening around this time while Donald Trump was the president. And the reactions were very different. After 9/11, Congress came together, they put the partisanship aside, and they really tried to work together to move forward. Now, that didn't last a long time, but it did start out that way. And it seems that everybody had a different opinion on who you should listen to. You had the president disagreeing with the health leadership team that he selected, Dr. Birx, Dr. Fauci, and doing it literally in the White House press briefing room in front of the American public. And then everybody's left scratching their heads on who they should listen to. So when you have leadership that isn't all on the same page, that's problematic, whether you're talking about relying on scientific evidence or anything else. But the flip side of that is, what are we demanding out of our electeds? You know, are we demanding the type of leadership that gets us through a pandemic? And are we holding them accountable? So the people on the left would probably say, yes, Donald wasn't reelected. We made our voices clear. The people on the right, however, say that the election was illegitimate and that it was stolen. And so it leaves kind of regular everyday people scratching their heads on who they listen to, and then they turn to social media. And they just get more disinformation or some accurate information. And at that point, you throw your hands up in the air and you don't want to mess with any of it. And then you become what we would call a disenfranchised voter.
Rashard, did you want to answer the question?
Yes, ma'am. The leadership, in fact, is responsible right off the back. You know, when we talk about science, there's science that supports one way, there's science that supports the other. But what it really comes down to is people, can they trust their leader? Can their leaders be consistent with what they're saying, right? You know, when there's constant going back and forth, when we talk about that moderate group, that reasonable group, those are the reasonable people, the people who are afraid to make a decision because of all the noise, because of the going back and forth. And also the young people, again, are highly intelligent. The young people see and they know when a crisis is being used for the good, and they understand when a crisis is being used for the bad. And America's really fumbling that right now, really trying to discern um, who's trying to benefit from a crisis, who's trying to gain power, or who's actually trying to help, who's actually trying to push everything forward. And so, um, you know, I think it's just very important to understand, for young people and for all Americans to understand, is to take a step back, look at the consistency of what someone is saying, and pay attention to agendas. Because if you're anti, right, media was one of the big deals on there today. Anytime you say no to a media or anything, you're a conspiracy or you're a crazy person. And so the media establishment needs to do a better job of unifying the country instead of supporting um, ideological beliefs.
I think that's a great question. I think what also comes to mind for me is the role of leadership and rhetoric. When you look at the rise of fake news, what that does is really question the news sources, where we get information, how that news is brought about, and when you begin to question the validity and credibility of information sources that have been long trusted, then it opens up a gateway that makes it difficult to trust other traditionally reliable sources of information, whether it be data and research, polling, surveying. I think it just opened the floodgates to question sources of information that we have long held as sources that have been reliable. And so rhetoric, I think, plays a large role in that. So do we have any other questions from the audience?
How do you think all the radicalism going on in the current political sphere, in like electorate and like the voters, has shifted how elections are run in these years?
So in many ways, politicians are a reflection of their community, and it's a hard role to play some days. I'm not sure if I were elected if I would have gotten out of bed for the last year and went into the office or zoomed into the office, and it's overwhelming as a person, right? Electeds are people, and I think we forget that. We expect them to wave a magic wand and fix everything that's wrong, but they're people, and they have to work with other people to get to a resolution, to move an agenda forward or an item. And think about it in your everyday, if all you heard was negative, 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 you're not doing what I want, this is wrong, you're lying, it's all wrong, 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 it becomes really defeating and hard. They have to really learn how to kind of filter out the negative and get out of the rhetoric and get to the point. But again, it's just driven us all farther to the extremes in both what we say and do and in our actions we take to try and influence government.
Mm-hmm. Rashard, did you want to provide additional thoughts on that question?
Can you restate the question? I think there's a little lag.
Sure, can you restate the question for us?
Yeah, so for like the radicalism that has been going on in like the voters and elected officials, how do you think that has shifted how elections are run?
With all the radical rhetoric, how has
That's
that shaped?
that's a
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, how it's captured, right? So how it's captured and how it's highlighted to the rest of America. It's very interesting. Some of you may not know this or not, but on Netflix, there's a series of the OJ trial, which was right around the year I was born, and it's insane that I'm just now learning about it. But learning how media and how the public's perception of what's going on, what's happening, what the cause and what the movement is can affect our political and our legal system. And so I think, you know, as young people, as the new generation coming, and as a nation, the accountability piece has to be there. In college, I took a class called Criminal Justice and Film, um, where we had a psychologist, we had certain people come in and basically break down video footage of us and teach us how to analyze things, agendas, and different cycles and things like that. So I think the more we educate ourselves, the more we pay attention, the more we can fight back against the radical pieces, and hopefully America will be able to discern what's real and what's not.
Well, both of my panelists have aged themselves at some point, whether you were here
I'm
when
feeling
the
really
Dole
old now
Discussion
after he just
started.
said that.
Exactly, or you were just being born when the OJ trial was taking place. No one can accuse me of not having young people in this discussion series at this point.
I think to follow up a little bit on what he was saying is, and I was talking about the elected, and he was talking about the media's role in not doing this, but I think we all have a role in it too. So my business partner, who's actually been doing this work longer than I have, he a lot of times will read a headline, and he will make up in his mind based on the headline on what it said, what the article said, without reading the article. And I'll think to myself, that doesn't sound right. So I'll go read the article, and then I'll say, okay, you should have read the article because you missed this, this, and this out of the article. I think we all make assumptions way too often, just based, and campaigns operate that way because we know that. That's why you have these little one slogan, two slogan campaigns, and it's really which side's talking points, short ones, appeal to the most people, and that's who wins. So I think we all have a responsibility to not repeat things that we think are probably not true or are faulty or not based on evidence. And to question each other if we're doing that, and don't click on it, don't share it if you find that maybe it wasn't true. The problem with social media is the main point of it is to get a reaction, to get the most likes, to get views, to all of that. So that also kind of drives us because, as he was saying earlier, we all have busy lives, we have kids to get places, we have work to do, we have soccer practice, we have to get the trash out, we need to go to the grocery store. And so we don't have time to really investigate our elected officials and those running. And so we get caught up in those little slogans. Oh, well, she stands for more funding in public education. She could be completely against everything else that I'm for, but I caught that one thing and I don't have a lot of time to check her out or any of the opponent, so I'm just going to vote for her. It's really about name recognition, and the easiest way to get the highest name recognition is to evoke emotions in people, because that's how they commit it to their brain, your name, whether it was a super positive emotion, but more so a negative emotion. Everybody complains about getting campaign mail, but we're not going to stop sending it. You know why? Because it works. It works, it works. In those 15 seconds, and they've done studies on this, that you look at that piece of mail on the front and on the back, and you always look at campaign mail differently now. How many times you see that person's name? You will see that person's name more than anything. It will be put on there in a way that jumps out at you, and then a few key words meant to trigger a response in your brain will also be highlighted in that mail piece. And the pictures are worth 1,000 words on those mailers. And those pictures will be different depending on what part of the city or the congressional district or the state representative district we're mailing into. But that picture is going to reflect what your values are, what the people around you look like in your neighborhood and your community, so that you feel like you are part of this person's vision.
It's a paper version of clickbait.
Yes.
headlines that cause you to click, but maybe don't have the substance beneath them in the article, or may have it, but because they want you to click and because they know you're inundated with information, don't have the time to research or read, you're going to read that headline and move forward with that information.
And we're very much operating in a state of fear, right? People aren't really running so much against the other person or the other party or their ideas. We're running motivated on how we can tap into a person's fear. You know, whether some of that is race-driven, whether some of that is equity-driven, male versus female, rich versus poor, working versus non. If you really think about it, those are most of the messages you get, us versus them. No matter who the us is, no matter who the them is, well, I'm going to interpret the us that fits my mold of me and the people around me and my family, and I'm going to interpret them as who I perceive, and you're going to interpret that differently, and she's going to interpret that differently, and they're going to interpret that differently. But it's a very easy us versus them. It's a universal thing that can be said, and a message. And the Democrats, speaking of messaging, tend to be horrible about messaging versus the Republicans. So it's really about the message and the amount of time you're willing to donate and checking into that message.
Yeah, we saw a lot of that, especially with candidates running to get the vote of the Black community in the presidential elections, where the message was anything but Trump. Trump will be the worst thing ever, but you didn't get the message about why Biden should be the choice and what you stand to gain from a Biden presidency. Rashard, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's extremely accurate. I think the Black community is really waking up, right? It's not enough for anyone to wave their Black Lives Matter flag or their sign. It's, hey, what is your Black agenda? Right? For many years, we've seen policy that's done nothing but decimate our communities in a lot of ways. Black communities starting to hold local school boards accountable, city council accountable, as well as federal. And so, yeah, there's the image of everything. It sounds good and it's grabbing, but it really gave me a lot of hope. I ran in a heavy Democratic district. I knew that district, and I felt like the people made the right decision. I felt like it was fair. I wasn't projected to do as well as I did, but we knocked every door. We got in front of people. They got to see me. They got to feel me. They got to hear my story. And so, I feel like regardless of the rhetoric, regardless of what's going on, there's a fighting chance for whether you're a Democrat or Republican to get out in any district and communicate with those people and let them know who you are, your heart, and why they should elect you.
Okay, well, with that, if we don't have any other questions, that is going to conclude our first in-person and virtual Dole Discussion Series for fall 2021. Give yourselves a round of applause. I'd like to thank my panelists, Mindy Brissey and Rashard Young, for joining us today for a great discussion and a great kickoff to the 2021 Dole Fellowship Series. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you for having us. This was really great. I enjoyed being here. And this is a great fellowship. Congratulations to you on that. And if anybody would like to talk, I'll hang around a little bit afterwards. I'm always looking for young people who are interested in the campaign world.
And Rashard, hopefully you can join us in person at some point in the future so we can talk to you in person. But thank you for joining us today. Thank you again to the Dole Institute for putting this great discussion series on. Today's discussion series was made possible by the Newman's Own Foundation. They've supported the series for a number of years, and without them we wouldn't be able to do and have the great discussions that we have here today. So thank you to the Newman's Own Foundation. If you're wanting to learn more information about Mindy Brissey and Powerful Performance Solutions or Rashard Young, their information or at least tags to their social media or ways to contact them can be made available. If you'd like to learn more about Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet, you can visit our website at www.shirleyskitchencabinet.org. Be sure to join us next week. We have 6 more to go right here, same place, same time, the Dole Institute 2021 Fall Discussion Series. Thank you all for joining us.